Do you think time heals all wounds, or some never close?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Last night, I learned exactly where I rank in my own family, and by the time I went to bed, I knew something had shifted forever. The dinner was supposed to be about me, about the promotion I worked years to earn, the one that finally moved me into leadership after every late night, every skipped holiday, every time I told myself to push harder because eventually it would pay off. Then, and I had booked a private room at a nice place, nothing flashy, just a place where we could sit down with my parents, my sister, and a few close friends, and for once I would be at the center of the story. For once, I would not be clapping in the audience for someone else. The evening started out fine. Ben gave a quiet toast about how proud he was, and my boss had even sent over a bottle of champagne with a little card that said, "To the future." I stood to say a few words about my team, about how they had carried me, and I swear I had just taken a breath when I heard that sharp clink of a glass being tapped. I turned my head, and there was Sam, standing with her phone in one hand, eyes shining like she had been waiting for this exact second. She said, "I'm getting married," in a voice loud enough that the servers stopped walking. The room broke into applause. My mother clapped until her rings hit together. My father shouted something about, "Finally," like this was the moment we had all been waiting for, and even my parents' friends who barely knew her stood up to hug her. The only two people not clapping were me and Ben. He slid his hand onto my knee under the table, steady and warm, but I kept staring at my plate because I knew if I looked up I might actually cry in front of everyone. It wasn't just that she stole the moment. It was that nobody seemed to notice it was stolen. They acted like it was natural, like the world had finally gotten interesting now that Sam had made an announcement. My mother whispered to her, "You had to say it tonight, didn't you?" Perfect timing. Perfect timing. That was the phrase that made my chest burn. I forced myself to finish my toast, but nobody was listening. My father raised his glass toward Sam and started making a speech of his own, about how proud he was, about how she always lit up a room, about how she deserved to be celebrated. Not a single word about me, the one who had actually organized and paid for the dinner. I sat there with a smile stretched across my face like it had been glued on. I let them chatter about venues and dresses while the food went cold in front of me. Ben leaned toward my ear and whispered, "You know this isn't right. You know we don't have to swallow it." I nodded, but I stayed silent. Years of training had taught me to swallow it, to keep the family peace, to let Sam shine while I dimmed myself. Then the check came. It landed in front of me because it always landed in front of me. The unspoken rule was that I covered, because I was the one with the steady job, the one who could afford it. My father nudged it toward me with his knuckles like he always did, not even looking at me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't reach for it. I pulled out my wallet, slipped my card into the little folder, and told the server, just my dinner and his. My father looked up like I had slapped him. "What are you doing?" he asked, like the question was absurd. I looked at him and said calmly, "I'm paying for us. You can handle the rest." The silence that followed was heavier than the applause had been. My mother's mouth actually fell open, and Sam gave me this look like I had broken some sacred rule. Ben didn't move, didn't speak, just kept his hand on mine. The server nodded, split the bill, and for once I didn't cave and say, "Never mind, I'll cover it." I let it happen. I let them pay. And when my father muttered, "You're being dramatic," I looked him in the eye and said, "No. I'm done being taken for granted." We left before dessert. In the car, the quiet was so thick it felt like another person sitting in the back seat. Ben drove a few blocks before he finally said, "You know we could flip the plan tonight if you want. We don't have to wait until next year." I knew exactly what he meant. We had talked in passing about a small city hall wedding, something simple without drama, but I had always said we should give it time. That night, sitting with my phone buzzing from messages about Sam's ring photo already spreading across social media, I turned to him and said, "I mean it. I'm ready." And that was the moment it all began. I had drawn one line, just one, and already the world looked different. I didn't know yet how far I was willing to go, but I knew this. I was not going to let my story get hijacked again. Morning pressed in before I was ready to face anyone, and while the light in the room was soft and regular, the phone on my nightstand kept rattling like it had a score to settle. Because the group chat had decided that my sister's ring needed a publicist, and every cousin, aunt, and neighbor who once fed the cat was apparently part of the street team. Which meant that by the time I opened my eyes, I was already behind on a conversation I never asked to join and had no interest in financing. Ben was in the kitchen making coffee with that careful patience he uses when he senses I am carrying something heavy and pretending it is a purse, and as soon as I joined him, he slid the mug across the counter and waited for me to speak, which I did. But not about feelings or legacy or any of the big words that swallow a day whole. I told him I was done letting other people spend my money and my time like they were party favors, and I needed to put that in writing so no one could later claim I had been unclear, unkind, or unstable. The first thing I did, because I've learned that clarity without paperwork is just noise, was open the family thread and type a message that sounded nothing like the woman who always smoothed things over, a message that said I was happy for Sam and I wished her well, and that I would not be paying for deposits, dress fittings, showers, photographers, or any other wedding expenses, not in part, not in full, not through loans that somehow never return, and that I would love to attend whatever event respected basic courtesy and the most obvious etiquette, which is that you do not hijack someone else's milestone unless your house is actually on fire. I stared at that text longer than I care to admit, because a lifetime of being the dependable one trains you to explain your boundaries like you are apologizing for a late library book. Yet I hit send anyway, and the moment the little delivered marker appeared, I felt a click inside my chest that sounded like a lock turning, not on me, but for me. The replies came fast and perfectly on brand, with my mother starting in on how families help families and how, between your promotion and Ben's steady work, you two are in the best position, then pivoting to a nostalgic memory about sharing toys as children. As if my professional life and Sam's decision to announce a wedding during my dinner could be solved by returning a plastic doll, and my father chiming in with a comment about how the men in his generation handled things without making a scene, which made me laugh out loud because last night's perfect timing had been a scene of his applause. Ben watched me read every message and then asked, very simply, whether I still wanted what we had talked about during Saner weeks, which was a small ceremony at City Hall followed by a dinner where we looked each guest in the eye and thanked them for the ways they had actually shown up for us in real life, not on social media. And I realized that the event we had sketched in pencil had just gained ink, because waiting would only create a wider target for everyone else's expectations to stick to. And I wanted something clean, quick, and honest before the family machine spun up and tried to package me back into the quiet role. We opened our laptops at the table like two people planning a road trip that could no longer be postponed, and in less than an hour we had a clerk appointment. A simple restaurant with a private room and a fixed menu prepaid, so there would be no opportunity for someone to swoop in with a toast or a microphone, an officiant recommended by a colleague who had a calm voice and a backbone, and an agreement that the language on the invitation would do something I had never allowed my invitations to do before, which was protect me. I wrote the announcement the way I write performance reviews when I truly want someone to succeed, direct and specific and free of sugar fog, and it said that Ben and I were getting married in a few weeks at City Hall. That the dinner afterward would be for a small circle that had supported us through the grind and the gray days as well as the good ones, that there would be no speeches because we had already said what mattered to the people who needed to hear it, and that the guest list was set and could not expand. Not because we lacked generosity, but because we were choosing intimacy over spectacle, which meant that if you had not been at my promotion dinner by choice, you were not on this list by design. Ben read it, nodded once, and suggested we schedule it for noon the following day, so we could live a few quiet hours before the storm, and I agreed, because the future I wanted required a spine and a calendar. Not more discussions about who meant well and who did not, so we set the email, queued the private link with the restaurant details for the people invited, and backed up all the confirmations to a shared folder labeled with a simple word that felt like an oath we could both keep: boundaries. The rest of the day was one long tug of war with a rope I refused to touch, as my mother shifted from wheedling to warning, as my father sent a clipped message about tradition, as Sam posted a close-up of her ring with a caption about the soft launch at dinner. That made me want to throw my phone across the room, and through it all been cooked, cleaned, and kept the house steady, which gave my nervous system something solid to rest on while my family acted like I had stolen a crown I was never allowed to wear. By late evening, the thread had cooled into that brittle calm that always comes before the next performance, and I brushed my teeth with the kind of mechanical focus you use when the only thing you can control is what you do next. And I told myself that tomorrow at noon I would press a button that would make everything simple even if it made nothing easy, because the truth inside the message was not cruel, it was just finally honest. When the clock on my phone slid toward noon and the scheduled email hovered like a bird about to leave my hand, the screen lit up with my mother's name, and the little letters said she was calling now, which meant she had chosen the last possible second to try and pull me back into the old choreography, and I stared at the phone long enough to hear the first ring echo in the kitchen, then watched the second ring blink across the glass, and as the third ring began I put the phone face down on the table and let it continue without me. The scheduled message lifted off at noon exactly, not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I wanted the one clean moment where the plan left my hands and became real. And as I watched the little progress bar glide across the screen, I felt something I did not recognize at first, a combination of relief and fear that tasted like oxygen after being underwater too long, which told me I had done the only right thing available even if the fallout arrived like a storm I could not outtalk. The announcement was short, careful, and built like a door that only opened one way, and it said that Ben and I were getting married at City Hall in a few weeks, that the dinner afterward would be a small table of the people who had actually stood with us through the grind and the mess and the years when nothing glamorous happened, that there would be no speeches or surprises because we did not want to show, and that the guest list was set and would not expand, a decision made for peace and not to punish, which I wrote in plain words so no one could pretend they misunderstood. We had prepaid the room, locked the head count, and posted the deposit so hard that even a professional meddler could not pry it open, and the officiant was confirmed by an email with a timestamp and a real signature, which meant that any attempt to derail things would have to be a loud, public shove rather than the usual whisper campaign, and for once I felt ready for a shove. Read receipts started popping up like fireworks, and I watched names light from gray to blue as relatives opened the link, and in the space of a few breaths my phone became a small arena where two things were true at once. Because friends from work replied with the kind of love that lands like a hand on your back when you are close to falling, while family I had fed and housed and called during their own long nights suddenly had a lot to say about loyalty, tradition, and who I thought I was to decide anything without a committee. Carol tried first with a gentle voice that always preceded a guilt monologue, telling me that this felt exclusionary and that weddings were for bringing people together, not drawing lines. Which made me want to ask where that sermon had been last night when the line around my moment had been erased without a second thought. But I did not write that, because I had promised myself not to fight in the old language where I lost even when I won. So I thanked her for sharing her feelings and told her the details were final, and we hoped she would wish us well regardless. The phone barely had time to dim before Sam called, and when I answered, she already had the front camera on, like this was a story she planned to record if she got the reaction she wanted. And I could see the way her face flushed as she said that I had blindsided her and that my announcement was designed to humiliate, and that of all the days to pull something like this I had chosen the one after her big news because I could not stand to share a spotlight, which would have been funny if it did not feel like someone pressing a thumb into a bruise. So I told her that I had not pulled anything, that I had finally put down a weight that was never mine, and that she was welcome to be happy about her engagement without making a mess on my table. And if that felt like a threat, then maybe the problem was not my boundaries, but the way she had learned to live inside other people's moments as if they were free rooms to sublet. She switched registers the way she always does when charm fails, her voice going sharp and fast, asking whether I was really going to keep our parents off the list, whether I understood how that would look to the extended family, whether I actually felt good about the idea that people who chose not to show up for my promotion would not be handed front row seats at my wedding, and I told her the truth in a tone I had saved for negotiations that mattered, which was that I no longer cared how it looked, I cared how it felt, and it felt like sanity. She shouted my name in a way that made Ben look up from across the room. Then she cut the call and the screen went black, and for a few seconds I just stared at my reflection because I needed a buffer before the next round. The next round came in a single line from my father, a message so short it might have sounded harmless if it had not carried the full weight of every old bargain, and it said that if I was going to exclude family, then I should return my grandmother's bracelet, since that was a family heirloom and not a prize for good behavior, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly what he was trying to do, which was reach for the one object that had been promised to me in writing when I was a teenager. The one thing my grandmother had pressed into my hand with a quiet, "This is yours," because even in a family that turned everything into a committee, that bracelet had been a private contract between two women who understood what it costs to hold yourself together. The old habit would have been to drive across town and hand it over to prove I was not greedy, to buy a little piece by giving away the one thing that had been mine without argument, and I almost moved out of muscle memory. But then I caught myself, opened the drawer where I keep the documents that matter, and pulled out the letter my grandmother wrote, the one that stated in plain language that the bracelet was a gift, not a loan. And as I read her words, I felt the ground under me settle enough to carry what came next. I sat at the dining table with the letter spread beside my laptop and the bracelet resting in its small box like a quiet witness. And as I read my grandmother's neat sentences that named me as the owner with no conditions attached, I felt how easily I could have forgotten this proof in the noise of everyone's opinions, which is why I scanned the page into a clean PDF, renamed it with the date she wrote it and the word gift spelled out in full so there would be no confusion, and attached it to a reply to my father that used the kind of language I reserve for contracts, because I have learned that when people want to drag you into an argument about feelings, you sometimes have to walk them back to facts, and let the facts stand there without apology. I told him I would not be returning something that was given to me outright, that I understood he was hurt and surprised by my choices, and that I would not debate my boundaries through objects, since the bracelet was not a bargaining chip and neither was my wedding, and before I hit send I showed the note to Ben, who read it twice, squeezed my shoulder, and said it met the only standard that mattered now, which was clarity with kindness that did not fold. The message left my outbox with the attached letter like a little lifeboat, and while it traveled I opened a folder on my desktop labeled receipts, where I had kept unglamorous evidence of past decisions I rarely mentioned. Small statements and bank transfers that told a longer story than any family anecdote ever did, and I felt the weight of those lines in my palm when I thought about the semester I quietly covered when Sam could not register because of an unpaid balance, and the dental bill I split without making her sign anything because I thought generosity counted for more when it did not come with a contract. And I realized that part of my anger at their demands came from the way I had built a history of quiet help that they treated as an opening rather than a gift, which meant that I needed to stop pretending those favors were evidence of my goodness and start treating them as sunk costs that did not obligate me to bleed forever. My phone lit up with my mother's name, and I let it ring until voicemail took over, because I was not going to be pulled into another loop where she cried and I softened, and we emerged with a narrative that made me sound rigid and her sound reasonable. So instead, I wrote her a short email that said I loved her and I was not available for a call today, that all information about the wedding would arrive in writing to prevent misunderstandings, and that any conversation about money would be a simple no, not from anger, but from a decision to stop running a family credit line in my head. And I felt the old guilt flare and fade like an overtaxed light bulb as I pressed send and watched the message tuck itself beneath the bracelet reply in my sent folder where the record would hold. Because I knew that leaving people to stew without offering even a hint of a constructive path can turn boundary setting into theater, I opened a new message to Sam and wrote one paragraph that counted as the most adult thing I have ever sent her, which said that I hoped she enjoyed her engagement, that I would not fund any part of it, that if money was tight there were 3 planners in town who worked on sliding scales, and here were their names and numbers, that venues book fast, and here was a concise list of places that accommodate the size of event she always imagined, and that I was sending this not as a passive-aggressive gesture, but because I wanted to remove the one excuse that always kept us circling, the excuse that I had blocked her dreams by failing to bankroll them. And while I knew she might twist my words into a weapon, I also knew that giving clean information without an emotional hook was the only way to prove to myself that I was done fighting on the old battlefield, where nothing healthy grew. Ben watched me breathe through that message, and when I clicked send he asked how I felt, which is a question that used to annoy me because I prided myself on being the person who could function without consulting her feelings. Yet I answered honestly that I felt lighter and also scared, because telling the truth to people who prefer fog makes the room look different, and sometimes you only realize how much fog you are tolerating when the air clears, and you can see how small you looked trying to navigate a maze that never had an exit. I closed the laptop, put the bracelet back in its box, and said out loud that I was not going to let anyone use my grandmother's love to leash me. Not today, and not next week when we stood in front of the clerk. And Ben nodded with the kind of agreement that comes from choosing the same life on purpose. For a few hours the house settled into a stillness that felt earned, and I folded laundry, answered 2 work emails, and made tea like a person whose day belonged to her, until my cousin Mara sent a screenshot without commentary. And the image showed a pastel flyer posted to a social feed with Sam's face tilted toward the camera and the words, "I said yes party," curling across the top, followed by a date that landed exactly on the evening of our private dinner and a caption inviting everyone who loves love to drop by and celebrate, which would have been harmless if it were not such a precise echo of last night's hijack. And as the meaning landed, I felt anger arrive like a hot tide that tried to pull me into the old ocean. Then I steadied myself against the counter and told Ben what had appeared, and he looked at me steadily before asking the question that marked the line I had promised to hold. Did I want to change our plans to avoid a collision, or did I want to keep walking forward and let the collision show everyone exactly what kind of driver each of us had chosen to be? The screenshot of Sam's pastel flyer was still open on my phone the morning of our wedding, but instead of letting it poison the day, I set the device face down on the counter and reminded myself that we had already chosen the only answer worth keeping, which was to proceed exactly as planned, without apology and without bending to sabotage dressed up as spontaneity. Ben and I left the house in quiet determination, and at City Hall we signed our names and spoke the simple vows we had written, while the officiant's steady voice filled the room with a dignity that no outside noise could touch. The witnesses who mattered stood in a close circle, people who had earned their seats not by bloodlines or loud declarations, but by years of showing up in quiet ways, and as the papers were stamped and the clerk smiled, I felt something unclench inside me. A recognition that family can be chosen through actions and not only inherited through obligation. That evening the private dining room at the small restaurant felt nothing like the dinners of my past, because the atmosphere was not built on forced cheer or unspoken debts, but on the straightforward presence of people who wanted to celebrate us without demanding anything in return. And when the first course was cleared, I stood to make a short speech that had been circling in my mind for weeks. I told them that this dinner was not about payback or retaliation, that it was about honoring the people who had believed in us when it was neither convenient nor fashionable, and that it meant more than I could explain to have a table where every face represented support rather than expectation. I could see people nodding, leaning closer, and I realized that this was what it looked like when words landed in soil instead of sand, when they did not need to be twisted to fit someone else's storyline. After a pause, I added the part that no one expected, the part Ben and I had discussed late into the night after the chaos of the promotion dinner, when we had asked ourselves what legacy we wanted to build that no family argument could erase. I announced that with a portion of my promotion bonus, we had established a small scholarship in my grandmother's name, designed to help women in our city who were finishing a degree while working full-time. Because my grandmother had always told me that perseverance deserved recognition even when it was not flashy. The room grew so quiet that I could hear silverware resting against plates, and then the sound of clapping rose, not the distracted applause I had heard at so many family events, but the deep, sustained kind that comes from genuine respect. People's eyes watered, not from drama, but from the recognition that something meaningful had been placed into the world that night, something larger than the family scorecard that had consumed so many of our years. Across town, Sam was live on her social feed, showing off a crowded room of acquaintances and strangers cheering under balloons, spinning a narrative that she had been wronged and was now reclaiming her joy. Yet, by the time her video reached people who knew me, the scholarship announcement had already been posted on my company's account with photos of the ceremony and a simple caption about choosing peace and building opportunity, and the contrast required no explanation. Her screams from the phone days earlier had been raw and loud, but they did not travel as far as one quiet decision backed by receipts. And as I watched the likes and comments multiply under the scholarship post, I understood that the story I had been afraid to claim was now public in a way that could not be undone, because it was no longer just about me. It was about a principal with my grandmother's name attached to it, and even my parents could not argue that away without looking smaller than they wanted to appear. When the night wound down and our friends left with hugs and laughter, I sat with Ben in the empty room, plates cleared and candles burning low, and I asked him if he thought I had gone too far. He thought about it for longer than I expected before answering, and then he said that I had not gone too far. I had finally gone far enough, and that the only reason it felt extreme was because I had spent years believing that silence was balance. I let that sink in, because I knew he was right, and I felt the relief of no longer trying to fix a scale that had never been even in the first place. Later, when my phone buzzed again with my mother's number, I almost ignored it out of habit, but I picked up and listened as she spoke in a tone I had never quite heard from her before, softer and thinner, telling me that they had seen the scholarship news and that my grandmother would have been proud, and I answered calmly that I already knew that, because I had not needed her permission or her applause to do it. Only the memory of a woman who believed in effort without spectacle. The silence on the line stretched, and for once I did not rush to fill it. When I finally placed the phone down and looked across the room at Ben, I told him the truth I had been circling all along, that I had not set out to wound anyone, I had set out to stop bleeding. And if people felt cut by my decision, it was only because they had been pressing the knife into me for so long they mistook my release for harm. He reached across the table, took my hand, and we sat in that earned stillness with the knowledge that we had built something clean out of years of mess. Walking home under the quiet night sky, I understood that the war was not truly over, that my sister would continue her performances and my parents would wrestle with the story they wanted to tell, but I no longer felt chained to their version. The victory was not in silencing them, but in finally refusing to perform alongside them, and the satisfaction was sharper than revenge, because it came from knowing that the final move had been mine, carefully planned, cleanly executed, and impossible to hijack.